Close your eyes and imagine the vast Mongolian steppe at twilight, where endless grasslands roll like a green ocean beneath an infinite dome of sky. Here, where the horizon seems to touch eternity itself, the wind carries whispers of ancient stories, tales of transformation so profound they reshaped the very fabric of human civilization. 8 centuries ago, in this seemingly empty landscape, the world was about to change forever. The steppe breathes with a rhythm older than memory, its vastness both humbling and liberating. In the gathering dusk, you might catch the distant call of eagles circling high above, or hear the soft thunder of wild horses moving like shadows across the grassland. The air carries the scent of wild sage and the promise of stories yet to be told. This is a land where silence speaks louder than words, where emptiness contains infinite possibility. Tonight, we journey together into the heart of history's greatest empire, not merely a tale of conquest, but a profound meditation on how human ambition, wisdom, and adaptability can bridge vast distances and unite diverse peoples under a single vision. Like the steppe itself, this story begins in apparent simplicity and grows into something magnificent and complex, touching every corner of the known world. Here, in the gentle rhythm of wind through grass, we find the first breath of an empire that would stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. To understand the Mongols, you must first understand their cathedral, not built of stone and mortar, but woven from wind and sky, from the endless grasslands that rolled like green seas from horizon to horizon. The Mongols worshipped Tengri, the eternal blue sky, a deity as vast and encompassing as the dome of heaven that stretched above their homeland. This was not merely religion, but a way of seeing the world that would shape every aspect of their remarkable journey through history. Imagine yourself riding across these sacred grasslands in the early morning, when mist still clings to the valleys and the sun paints the eastern sky in shades of gold and amber. The earth beneath your horse's hooves pulses with life. Millions of wild flowers carpeting the steppe in spring, their fragrances mixing with the clean scent of untouched air. This land taught patience and endurance, for survival here required reading the subtle signs written in cloud formations, wind patterns, and the behavior of countless wild creatures. The Mongols understood what modern urbanites have largely forgotten, that humans are part of a larger web of life, dependent on forces far greater than themselves. Their gers, those ingenious felt dwellings, could be assembled or dismantled in less than an hour, allowing entire communities to flow across the landscape like flocks of birds following invisible currents. These were not primitive people, as later chroniclers would claim, but masters of a sophisticated technology perfectly adapted to their environment. Picture the interior of a ger on a winter evening, when the central fire casts dancing shadows on felt walls and the wind outside howls like a living thing. Families gathered around these fires, sharing stories that connected them to their ancestors and the cosmic order above. Children learned to read the night sky before they could decipher written words or RDS, understanding that the same stars that guided their seasonal migrations also governed the destiny of all living things under the eternal blue dome. The seasonal rhythm of nomadic life created a people uniquely attuned to change and adaptation. Spring brought the joy of new births, foals taking their first tentative steps on unsteady legs, lambs wobbling beside their mothers, human children born into a world that was simultaneously harsh and nurturing. The air filled with the sounds of renewal, the bleating of young animals, the songs of returning birds, the laughter of children discovering the world beyond their winter shelters. Summer offered abundance and gathering when scattered clans would converge at traditional meeting places for great assemblies. These gatherings were festivals of human connection, where news was shared across vast distances, marriages were arranged between distant families, and the brief flowering of the steppe was celebrated with fermented mare's milk and competitions that tested the skills essential for survival. Young men would race their horses across the grassland, their whoops of joy echoing under the vast sky, while elders shared the accumulated wisdom of generations. Autumn demanded preparation and wisdom as families anticipated the challenges ahead. The steppe transformed into a tapestry of gold and amber, and herders moved with purposeful urgency, reading in the behavior of animals and the subtle shifts in wind patterns, the approaching severity of winter. This was the season of decision-making, when leaders proved their worth through the choices that would determine whether their people would thrive or merely survive the months of cold and scarcity ahead. Winter taught the deepest lessons, endurance and the sacred value of community, when blizzards raged across the steppe and temperatures plunged to levels that could kill the youngsters. Prepared, survival depended entirely on the bonds that held society together. Families shared their stored provisions, their warmth, their stories, and their hope. In these months of hardship, the Mongol values of loyalty, mutual aid, and collective responsibility were not abstract principles, but immediate necessities for survival. This intimate relationship with the natural world fostered a spirituality, both practical and profound. The Mongols saw the divine not as separate from daily life, but woven into every aspect of existence, in the flight patterns of birds that predicted weather changes, in the behavior of horses that warned of approaching dangers, in the subtle shifts in seasons that meant the difference between prosperity and starvation. Their shamans served as intermediaries between the visible and invisible worlds, interpreting omens and performing rituals that maintained harmony between human communities and the cosmic forces that surrounded them. Yet every herder was also a priest in the temple of the steppe, attuned to the sacred rhythms that governed all life. They understood that the same forces that moved the great migrations of animals also moved the destinies of nations, that the individual must align itself with larger patterns to achieve lasting success. This cosmic perspective would later prove essential when Mongol leaders faced the challenge of governing not just tribes, but entire civilizations spanning continents. Western observers, viewing this civilization through the lens of settled agricultural societies, often dismissed nomads as chaotic and primitive. They could not understand that apparent disorder might mask a deeper kind of order, that mobility might represent a more sophisticated adaptation to environmental conditions than the rigid permanence of cities and farms. The Mongols had developed a social technology as elegant and efficient as their physical technology, creating networks of loyalty and obligation that could span vast distances without the need for written laws or permanent institutions. The democratic traditions of the steppe, where leaders earned authority through proven competence rather than inherited status, where major decisions were made through consensus in tribal assemblies, where merit mattered more than birth. These practices seemed anarchic to observers from hierarchical societies. Yet this flexibility and openness to talent, regardless of origin, would become one of the great sources of Mongol strength when they began their expansion beyond the traditional boundaries of nomadic territory. This sacred landscape shaped a people who would prove uniquely capable of connecting distant worlds, who understood that strength lay not in rigid adherence to tradition, but in the wisdom to adapt while maintaining essential spiritual and cultural foundations. From these windswept grasslands would emerge leaders who thought on a global scale, who could imagine an empire that transcended the boundaries of tribe, language, and settled territory. As night settles over the steppe and the first stars appear in the darkening sky, you can almost hear the echoes of that ancient world, the distant singing of herders guiding their flocks to shelter, the gentle snorting of horses settling for the night, the soft murmur of voices around fires that have burned in similar patterns for countless generations. In this vast quietude, in the intersection of human ambition and cosmic order, greatness was being born. In the year 1162, beneath the same eternal blue sky that had witnessed countless births and deaths across the generations, a child was born who would fundamentally alter the course of human history. His birth name was Temujin, and the circumstances of his arrival seemed anything but auspicious for future greatness. Yet in the harsh wisdom of the steppe, Adversity often forges the strongest steel, and this child's early years would be tempered by experiences that would shape him into one of history's most remarkable leaders. Picture, if you will, the interior of a traditional ger on that spring morning when Temujin drew his first breath. Holun, his mother, cradles her newborn son, noting with wonder the clot of blood clutched in his tiny fist. An omen, the shamans would later say, that he was born to hold the world in his hands. Outside, the wind carries the scent of new grass and the distant sounds of awakening herds, but inside this felt sanctuary, time seems suspended as a future emperor takes his place among the living. The child's father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man whose reputation for courage and wisdom had earned him respect among the scattered tribes, but whose death would soon leave his family vulnerable to the brutal realities of steppe politics. For in this world, without cities or walls, without written laws or permanent institutions, survival depended entirely on the intricate web of alliances, obligations, and blood feuds that bound communities together or tore them apart. Temujin's earliest memories would have been painted in the sensory richness of nomadic childhood, the feeling of his mother's strong hands teaching him to tend the fire that meant survival through bitter winter nights, the sound of his father's voice recounting the genealogies that connected their family to the legendary Alan Goa, the mythical ancestor of El Mongols. He would have learned to sleep to the gentle creaking of the ger's wooden frame as wind moved across the steppe, and to wake to the soft lowing of cattle being led to pasture in the grey light of dawn. But childhood on the steppe was never merely idyllic. By the age of 5, Temujin was already learning the skills that would determine whether he lived or died. How to read weather patterns in the behaviour of clouds, how to judge the mood of a horse from the set of its ears, how to detect the approach of strangers from changes in the behaviour of grazing animals. These were not games or academic exercises, but matter of life and death in an environment where a single mistake could doom an entire family. The turning point came when Temujin was still a boy, perhaps 9 years old, when his father was poisoned by enemies from the Tatar tribe during what should have been a peaceful feast. The news reached their camp like a physical blow, transforming their world from security to mortal danger in the space of a single messenger's words. Yesugei's death meant more than personal grief. It meant the dissolution of the alliances that had protected his family, the loss of status that made them valuable as allies or dangerous as enemies. What followed were the years that would forge the future conqueror's character in the harshest crucible imaginable. The Taichiud clan, who should have protected Yesugei's widow and children, instead abandoned them, driving them away from the traditional grazing grounds that had sustained their herds. Holun found herself alone with several young children, cast out onto the steppe with nothing but her own fierce determination to keep her family alive. Imagine the texture of those desperate years, gathering wild onions and garlic with fingers numb from cold, setting snares for small game with the patience of the truly hungry, learning to find sustenance in plants that others might dismiss as weeds. Temujin and his brothers became expert at reading the landscape for signs of edible roots, at tracking wounded animals through tall grass, at finding shelter in the lee of rocks when blizzards struck without warning. These experiences taught lessons no palace education could have provided. Hunger became a teacher that showed the true value of every grain of food, every sip of water. Cold became a master that demanded absolute attention to the details of survival. Abandonment became a tutor in the psychology of loyalty, showing how quickly alliances could dissolve when they were no longer advantageous, and how precious were those rare individuals who remained faithful through adversity. The boy learned to read human nature with the same intensity he had once applied to reading weather patterns. He discovered that desperation could make people cruel, but it could also reveal their fundamental character. He observed how his mother's quiet strength became a source of inspiration for the entire family, how her refusal to surrender to despair somehow made survival possible even when it seemed impossible. One particularly harsh winter, when their meager supplies had dwindled to almost nothing, Temujin killed his half-brother Bekta in a dispute over food, an act that would haunt him for the rest of his life, but which also demonstrated the pitiless calculations that survival sometimes demanded. His mother's reaction, her grief mingled with understanding of the terrible choices that desperation could force upon even good people, taught him that leadership would require making decisions that others could not or would not make. The physical hardships were matched by psychological challenges that would have broken lesser spirits. The humiliation of being captured by the Taichiud and held prisoner, forced to wear a wooden collar that marked him as a slave, might have crushed a different kind of person. But Temujin used even this degradation as an opportunity to learn, observing how power worked among his captors, studying the weaknesses that might someday be exploited, waiting with the patience of a natural predator for the moment when escape became possible. When that moment came, aided by a sympathetic guard who saw something exceptional in this young prisoner, Temujin's flight across the steppe became a metaphor for the transformation taking place within him. No longer merely a victim of circumstances, he was beginning to understand that survival required not just endurance, but strategic thinking, careful planning, and the ability to inspire others to take risks for a shared vision. The boy who had once gathered roots to stave off starvation was learning to gather something far more valuable: human loyalty. He was discovering that true strength came not from physical force alone, but from the ability to make others believe that their individual survival was connected to a larger destiny. Each person who helped him during these dark years, whether from compassion, calculation, or simple human decency, was teaching him lessons about the complex motivations that drive human behavior. By the time Temujin reached manhood, the experiences of his youth had created something unprecedented in the history of the steppe. A leader who combined the traditional values of nomadic society with a revolutionary understanding of how those values might be applied on a scale never before imagined. The boy who had learned to survive on wild onions and borrowed kindness was becoming a man who would reshape the relationship between peoples across continents. As he sat by his fire in the evenings, looking up at the same stars that had guided his ancestors across these grasslands for countless generations, Temujin was beginning to dream dreams that transcended the traditional boundaries of tribal ambition. The hardships that might have destroyed him had instead created a vision of unity, prosperity, and justice that would soon begin attracting followers from across the fractured landscape of Mongol society. The transformation of Temujin from a desperate survivor into a magnetic leader did not happen overnight, but through a gradual process of relationship building that would revolutionize the very foundations of steppe society. Unlike traditional tribal leaders who relied primarily on blood kinship and inherited authority, Temujin began to forge a new kind of community based on chosen loyalty, demonstrated competence, and shared vision. This innovation would prove to be one of his greatest contributions to human governance. Picture the scene as word began to spread across the scattered camps and seasonal gathering places of the Mongol tribes. There was a young man, they whispered, who treated even former enemies as potential brothers, who judged people by their actions rather than their ancestry, who spoke of unity and prosperity in terms that made ancient dreams seem suddenly achievable. These whispers traveled along the informal networks that connected the nomadic world, through traders carrying goods between distant settlements, through young people seeking marriage partners beyond their immediate families, through shamans moving between communities to perform their sacred rituals. The first to respond were often those who, like Temujin himself, had experienced the harsh realities of life at the margins of traditional tribal society. Outcasts and younger sons, skilled warriors whose talents had been overlooked by hidebound leaders, ambitious individuals who chafed under the limitations of inherited status. These were the people who initially gathered around the future Khan's growing campfire. Yet Temujin's genius lay not merely in attracting the disaffected, but in creating a social environment where traditional leaders also began to see advantages in voluntary association. Consider the careful psychology involved in incorporating defeated rivals into his growing organization. When Temujin's forces overcame an enemy group, the conventional steppe practice was either to drive them away or to absorb them as subordinates with inferior status. Instead, Temujin began experimenting with a radically different approach: genuine integration based on mutual benefit rather than domination. Defeated enemies who demonstrated skill and integrity were offered not just survival, but partnership in an enterprise that promised greater rewards than they could achieve independently. This process was neither simple nor without risk. Imagine the tension around those early campfires where former enemies sat side by side, sharing food and planning joint ventures, while ancient grievances and family feuds simmered beneath the surface of forced cooperation. Success required not just Temujin's leadership skills, but the active participation of individuals willing to set aside traditional loyalties in favor of something unprecedented. The gradual development of trust among these diverse groups became a fascinating study in human psychology and social innovation. The ceremonies that marked these new relationships often blended ancient traditions with innovative elements. Blood brotherhood rituals, where men would mingle their blood by drinking from the same cup or by pressing wounds together, took on new meaning when performed between individuals from different tribes or even different ethnic groups. These were not mere symbolic gestures, but profound commitments that restructured the social landscape of Central Asia. Participants understood that they were not just joining an alliance, but helping to create a new kind of society. Temujin's approach to leadership during this period reveals a sophisticated understanding of human motivation that would serve him well when governing vast multicultural territories. He recognized that people are motivated by a complex mixture of material needs, social aspirations, and spiritual yearnings. His growing organization offered material security through shared resources and mutual protection, social advancement through merit-based promotion rather than hereditary privilege, and spiritual fulfillment through participation in a mission that seemed divinely ordained. The daily life of these early communities was itself a revolutionary experiment in social organization. Picture the morning activities in one of Temujin's camps. Warriors from different tribes working together to tend the horses that were their most valuable possession, sharing knowledge about breeding, training, and veterinary care that had previously been guarded family secrets. Women from various backgrounds collaborating in the essential tasks of food preparation, textile production, and childcare, discovering that traditional techniques from different regions could be combined to create better results. Children growing up in these mixed communities were perhaps the most profound beneficiaries of this social innovation. They learned multiple dialects and customs from an early age, developing a cosmopolitan perspective that would serve them well in the expanded world that Temujin was beginning to envision. These children played together without regard to their parents' tribal origins, unconsciously modeling the kind of unity that their elders were consciously working to achieve. The economic benefits of cooperation soon became apparent to even the most skeptical observers. Herds managed collectively could be larger and more diverse than those maintained by individual families. Seasonal migrations could be planned more efficiently when multiple groups shared information about pasture conditions, weather patterns, and potential hazards. Trade with settled populations could be conducted more effectively when nomadic groups pooled their resources and coordinated their negotiations. But perhaps most importantly, military cooperation allowed these federated groups to defend themselves against threats that would have overwhelmed any individual tribe. When hostile forces approached, the rapid communication systems that Temujin had developed could mobilize warriors from across a wide geographic area, creating defensive capabilities that soon became offensive opportunities. Success in these early military ventures created a positive feedback loop, as victory attracted new followers while demonstrating the practical benefits of unity. The spiritual dimension of this unification process cannot be overlooked. Temujin and his followers understood their enterprise not merely as political or military innovation, but as fulfillment of ancient prophecies about the eventual unity of all peoples under the eternal blue sky. Shamans from different traditions began to find common ground in their interpretations of cosmic signs and omens. Dreams and visions were shared and discussed as evidence that the spirits themselves supported this unprecedented experiment in human cooperation. The process was not without its challenges and setbacks. Traditional tribal leaders who felt threatened by these developments sometimes organized resistance movements, appealing to conservative elements who preferred familiar hierarchies to innovative partnerships. Personal conflicts inevitably arose when individuals from different cultural backgrounds misunderstood each other's customs or felt that their traditional values were being compromised. Managing these tensions required all of Temujin's diplomatic skills and often creative solutions that satisfied multiple constituencies. Yet gradually, through a combination of demonstrated success, generous treatment of allies, and the compelling vision of a unified Mongol people, the movement gained momentum. Each successful integration made the next one easier, as potential allies could see concrete evidence of how cooperation benefited everyone involved. The network of relationships that Temujin was building began to take on a life of its own, spreading beyond his direct control as people throughout the region started to imagine new possibilities for their own lives and communities. The camps were becoming small cities, temporary but sophisticated settlements that moved across the landscape like slow-moving organisms, adapting to seasonal conditions while maintaining their essential character. The sight of these communities, hundreds of gers arranged in orderly patterns, thousands of horses grazing in coordinated herds, people of different backgrounds working together toward common goals, must have been both impressive and inspiring to observers from traditional tribal societies. Military innovations accompanied and supported these social developments. The decimal organization that would later become famous throughout the Mongol Empire began as a practical solution to the problem of integrating warriors from different tribal traditions. By organizing forces into units of 10, 100, and 1,000, with leaders chosen for competence rather than heredity, Temujin created a military structure that was both efficient and inclusive. Former enemies could serve alongside former allies under commanders whose authority derived from demonstrated ability rather than aristocratic birth. Training exercises became opportunities for cultural exchange as warriors shared techniques from their respective traditions. Archery methods from one region were combined with horsemanship skills from another, creating tactical innovations that enhanced the effectiveness of the entire force. The psychological impact of these mixed units was equally important. Soldiers who fought and trained together developed bonds that transcended their original tribal loyalties, creating the foundation for the international brotherhood that would characterize the mature Mongol Empire. As word of these developments spread, delegations began arriving from distant tribes, some seeking alliance, others merely curious about reports of the remarkable young leader who was transforming the social landscape of the eastern steppe. These visits became opportunities for diplomatic innovation as Temujin developed new protocols for negotiating with diverse groups while maintaining the principles that had guided his success. Each successful negotiation added to his reputation and attracted additional followers, creating a snowball effect that accelerated the pace of unification. The boy who had once survived by gathering wild roots was becoming the focal point for the most ambitious social experiment in nomadic history. Yet success brought new challenges and responsibilities that would test his leadership abilities in ways that mere survival never could. The growing size and complexity of his organization required administrative innovations, dispute resolution mechanisms, and strategic planning on a scale unprecedented in steppe society. The stage was being set for the great assembly that would formally recognize what had already begun to emerge, a new kind of political entity that would soon reshape the relationship between peoples across the known world. The spring of 1206 dawned across the Mongolian steppe with an energy that seemed to pulse from the earth itself, as if the ancient landscape sensed the momentous events about to unfold upon its vast expanses. From every corner of what would soon be known as Mongolia, streams of riders converged toward the headwaters of the Onon River, where the most significant political gathering in nomadic history was about to transform not just the Mongol peoples, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. Picture the scene as these delegates approached the chosen site, thousands upon thousands of horses creating a thunder that seemed to make the very ground tremble, their riders bearing the banners and symbols of dozens of tribes that had maintained separate identities for countless generations. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, thick with dust raised by this unprecedented gathering, fragrant with the smoke of countless cooking fires where families prepared for days of ceremony, negotiation, and celebration. The Kurultai, the Great Assembly, was an ancient institution among the nomadic peoples, a democratic tradition that allowed major decisions to be made through collective deliberation rather than autocratic decree. But this gathering was different from any that had come before, for its purpose was not merely to resolve disputes or coordinate seasonal migrations, but to formally acknowledge the emergence of something entirely new in human political organization, a unified Mongol nation under a single supreme leader. As delegates set up their camps according to ancient protocols, the careful choreography of steppe diplomacy began to unfold. Each tribal group maintained its traditional camping patterns and customs, yet all were participating in a process that would fundamentally alter those very traditions. Shamans moved between the camps, conducting the divinat, irons and rituals necessary to ensure that the proceedings would have divine blessing. The smoke from their sacred fires rose straight into the clear blue sky, which observers interpreted as a favorable sign from Tengri himself. The formal sessions of the Kurultai took place in a natural amphitheatre formed by gentle hills, where speakers could address the entire assembly while maintaining the circular patterns that symbolized equality and unity. Temujin, though clearly the central figure in these proceedings, initially took his place among the other tribal leaders, demonstrating the humility and respect for tradition that had characterized his approach to building consensus throughout his rise to prominence. The speeches that preceded the actual selection of the Supreme Khan were themselves works of political art, carefully crafted to honor the past while embracing the future. Elder after elder rose to recount the genealogies that connected all Mongols to their legendary ancestors, weaving together the mythological and historical threads that gave legitimacy to their collective identity. These orations served not merely as entertainment or ritual obligation, but as constitutional documents that established the legal and spiritual foundation for the unprecedented political entity about to be born. When the time came for the crucial decision, the process unfolded with the measured dignity that befitted its historical significance. Tribal leaders who had once been bitter enemies spoke in favor of unity under Temujin's leadership, their words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom about the benefits of cooperation over conflict. Military commanders detailed the victories that had already been achieved through coordinated action, while merchants and herders described the economic prosperity that had followed in the wake of political stability. The moment of formal selection was both climactic and oddly anticlimactic, for by the time the assembly formally proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, the outcome had become inevitable through the careful consensus building that had preceded the gathering. Yet the ceremonial aspects of his elevation were charged with symbolic meaning that resonated through every level of nomadic society. The new Khan was lifted on a felt carpet and raised above the assembled multitude, a ritual that symbolically connected him to the earth while elevating him above ordinary human status. The title Genghis Khan itself represented a revolutionary concept in nomadic political thought, leadership that transcended tribal boundaries and embraced responsibility for all peoples under the eternal blue sky. This was not merely a military promotion or political appointment. but a spiritual transformation that invested its recipient with quasi-divine authority. The oaths of loyalty that followed were equally unprecedented in their scope and intensity. Tribal leaders who had maintained independence for generations voluntarily surrendered their autonomy to become components of a larger organism. These were not grudging submissions extracted by force, but enthusiastic commitments to a vision that promised benefits beyond anything achievable through continued fragmentation. The emotional intensity of these moments was palpable, as hardened warriors wept openly while pledging their lives to their chosen leader and to each other. The establishment of the new legal code during this assembly represented another revolutionary innovation. The Yasa, as it came to be known, was not imposed from above, but developed through collective deliberation, incorporating the best elements of various tribal traditions, while establishing universal principles that would govern behavior throughout the emerging empire. The code emphasized meritocracy over aristocracy, religious tolerance over dogmatism, and practical effectiveness over ceremonial tradition. Military reorganization proceeded simultaneously with political transformation, as the tribal units that had characterized traditional steppe society were dissolved in favor of the decimal system that would become the hallmark of Mongol military efficiency. Warriors were redistributed into new units based on competence and complementary skills, rather than kinship or tribal affiliation, creating a military structure that was both more efficient and more inclusive than anything previously achieved in nomadic society. The symbolic dimensions of these changes were as important as their practical effects. Warriors who had once identified primarily with their birth tribes now wore the insignia of their new decimal units, marking their participation in an organization that valued achievement over ancestry. The mixing of personnel from different backgrounds created new friendships and loyalties that gradually superseded older allegiances, knitting together a social fabric that was both stronger and more flexible than traditional tribal structures. The spiritual ceremonies that concluded the Kurultai were designed to sanctify these earthly arrangements with divine approval. Shamans from all the participating tribes collaborated in elaborate rituals that invoked the blessing of Tengri and the ancestral spirits on the new enterprise. Sacred objects were exchanged between formerly separate groups, creating physical symbols of the spiritual unity that was meant to bind the Mongol people together in their expanded destiny. As the Great Assembly began to disperse, with delegates returning to their home territories to spread word of the momentous decisions that had been made, the psychological transformation was already apparent. People who had arrived at the Kurultai as members of separate tribes departed as citizens of a unified Mongol nation. The implications of this change would take years to fully unfold, but the essential transformation had already occurred in the minds and hearts of the participants. The new Genghis Khan remained at the sacred site for several days after the departure of the main assembly, consulting with his closest advisors about the practical implementation of the decisions that had been made. These planning sessions laid the groundwork for administrative innovations that would soon prove essential for governing territories far beyond the traditional boundaries of nomadic society. The boy who had once survived by his wits and determination had become the architect of a new form of human organization. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire Kurultai was how it managed to preserve the essential democratic character of nomadic society, while creating the unified leadership necessary for unprecedented expansion. The Mongol Empire would be characterized throughout its existence by this balance between centralized authority and distributed decision-making, between respect for tradition and openness to innovation, between local autonomy and imperial coordination. As night fell over the steppe and the last fires of the Great Assembly were extinguished, the stars that had witnessed countless generations of nomadic life now looked down upon a fundamentally transformed world. The age of tribal fragmentation was ending, and the era of global connection was about to begin. In choosing their universal ruler, the Mongol peoples had also chosen a destiny that would carry them far beyond the familiar horizons of their ancestral homeland. into adventures and achievements that would reshape the relationship between all the peoples of the earth. In the crystalline dawn of 1207, as morning mist rose from the steppes like ancestral spirits blessing new endeavors, the unified Mongol tribes prepared to test their revolutionary synthesis against the established powers of the sedentary world. What followed was not merely conquest in the conventional sense, but rather a systematic demonstration of how nomadic military philosophy, rooted in mobility, adaptability, and meritocratic organization, could challenge and ultimately transform the rigid hierarchical structures that had dominated Eurasian warfare for centuries. The genius of early Mongol campaigns lay not in their brutality, though that aspect has dominated popular imagination, but in their unprecedented integration of diverse military technologies and tactical approaches under a unified command structure. Genghis Khan's armies represented a living laboratory of warfare, continuously absorbing and refining techniques encountered across their expanding theaters of operation. Chinese siege engineers worked alongside Persian cavalry specialists, while Mongol horse archers coordinated with Khitan infantry formations, creating a military synthesis that transcended traditional cultural boundaries and represented something entirely novel in the annals of warfare. The decimal organization system, where armies were structured in units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, reflected a profound understanding of command dynamics that modern military theorists still study. This mathematical precision in organization enabled coordination across vast distances and diverse terrain, while maintaining the flexibility essential to nomadic tactical doctrine. Each tumen of 10,000 warriors functioned as a semi-autonomous unit capable of independent operation, yet remained integrated within larger strategic frameworks through sophisticated communication networks that utilize D-mounted messengers, signal fires, and standardized tactical protocols. The psychological dimensions of Mongol warfare proved equally revolutionary. Their reputation for offering terms before battle, surrender and live, resist and face total destruction, represented a calculated use of fear as a weapon of statecraft. This was not mindless barbarity, but rather a sophisticated understanding that winning without fighting represented the highest form of military art. Cities that submitted found themselves incorporated into an expanding commercial and administrative network. Those that resisted provided object lessons that resonated across vast distances, reducing future resistance through the mere memory of their fate. Consider the siege of Zhongdu, the Jin dynasty capital, where Mongol forces demonstrated their capacity for patient, methodical warfare that contradicted stereotypes of nomadic impetuosity. For months, they maintained a siege that required not only military discipline, but sophisticated logistics, feeding and supplying armies far from their traditional pastoral base, while coordinating with allied forces and managing complex siege equipment operated by Chinese defectors. The city's eventual fall in 1215 marked not just a military victory, but a symbolic moment when nomadic power successfully challenged one of the most formidable fortress cities in East Asia. The integration of Chinese military engineers into Mongol armies exemplified their pragmatic approach to technological innovation. These specialists brought knowledge of counterweight trebuchets, gunpowder weapons, and advanced siege techniques that transformed Mongol capabilities against fortified positions. Yet rather than simply adopting these technologies wholesale, Mongol commanders modified and adapted them to complement their existing tactical doctrines, creating hybrid approaches that maximized the advantages of both nomadic mobility and sedentary engineering expertise. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire between 1219 and 1221 revealed the full maturation of Mongol strategic thinking. This campaign stretched across thousands of miles, from the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush, requiring coordination between multiple armies operating independently, yet in strategic concert. The destruction of cities like Bukhara and Samarkand demonstrated Mongol capacity for devastating siege warfare, while their pursuit of the fleeing Khwarezm Shah across Central Asia showcased their unprecedented logistical reach and strategic persistence. Yet even in destruction, patterns of construction emerged. Mongol armies consistently spared artisans, scholars, and administrators, recognizing that conquest without subsequent governance represented Pyrrhic victory. The systematic deportation of skilled populations to different regions of the growing empire created networks of expertise that would prove crucial for future administration. Persian administrators found themselves governing Chinese territories, while Central Asian craftsmen established workshops in distant Mongol capitals, creating a circulation of knowledge and technique that transcended traditional cultural boundaries. The evolution of Mongol military doctrine during these early campaigns reflected their fundamental adaptability to diverse geographical and cultural environments. In the forests and rivers of northern China, they learned to coordinate cavalry operations with infantry and siege warfare. In the deserts of Central Asia, they perfected supply techniques that enabled extended operations far from water sources. In the mountains of Afghanistan and Persia, they developed specialized techniques for highland warfare that challenged conventional assumptions about nomadic limitations. Religious and cultural policies during conquest phases revealed sophisticated understanding of governance cycle. Ogi. Rather than imposing a single cultural or religious framework, Mongol administrators typically preserved existing social structures while inserting themselves. The transformation of the ancient Silk Roads under Mongol hegemony represents one of history's most profound examples of how political unification can catalyze economic and cultural revolution. What had previously existed as fragmented trade routes, vulnerable to local conflicts and bureaucratic inefficiencies, evolved under the Pax Mongolica into humanity's first truly global commercial network, a vast circulatory system that pumped goods, ideas, and innovations across the Eurasian landmass with unprecedented velocity and security. Picture the dawn breaking over a medieval caravan city, perhaps Samarkand or Bukhara, where the night's cool stillness gives way to the organized chaos of international commerce. Merchants from Venice adjust their woolen cloaks against the morning chill as they negotiate with traders from Beijing over bolts of silk that shimmer like captured sunlight. The air fills with a symphony of languages: Arabic, Persian, Chinese, Mongolian, Latin, creating a linguistic tapestry that reflects the unprecedented cultural convergence facilitated by Mongol administration. The genius of Mongol commercial policy lay not merely in their military protection of trade routes, but in their systematic elimination of the bureaucratic obstacles that had traditionally impeded long-distance commerce. The paisa system, standardized imperial passports, revolutionized international travel by creating a uniform credential recognized from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. These documents, crafted from precious metals and bearing the Khan's seal, served as more than mere identification. They represented a fundamental reconceptualization of sovereignty that transcended traditional territorial boundaries. Consider the psychological transformation this represented for medieval merchants. Previously, each political boundary had meant new customs, different currencies, unfamiliar laws, egal systems, and the constant risk of confiscation or arbitrary taxation. Under Mongol rule, a trader departing from Kaffa on the Black Sea could travel to Kambalik with reasonable confidence that his goods would be protected, his contracts honored, and his disputes adjudicated according to consistent principles. This predictability was revolutionary, creating an environment where long-term commercial planning became possible for the first time in human history. The technological innovations that emerged from this commercial renaissance reflect the creative synthesis that occurred when diverse cultural traditions encountered one another under conditions of mutual profit. Chinese papermaking techniques, transmitted westward through Mongol trade networks, revolutionized record-keeping and correspondence throughout the Islamic world and eventually reached Europe. Islamic mathematical concepts, particularly advanced algebra and astronomical calculations, traveled eastward to influence Chinese science and engineering. The compass, gunpowder, and printing technology spread across continents through commercial channels that had been secured by Mongol military power. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency across the empire represented an early experiment in economic integration that anticipated many features of modern global commerce. Imagine the practical impact of this innovation. A merchant in Novgorod could calculate the value of goods destined for markets in Karakorum using standardized units that remained consistent across thousands of miles of territory. This mathematical uniformity reduced transaction costs, minimized disputes, and enabled the kind of complex financial planning that sophisticated commerce requires. The relay stations of the YAM system served not only military and administrative functions, but became crucial nodes in the commercial infrastructure of the empire. These installations, positioned at strategic intervals along major trade routes, provided fresh horses for messengers, secure storage for valuable goods, and standardized facilities for international travelers. The economic impact extended far beyond their official functions, as these stations became focal points for local commerce, attracting artisans, suppliers, and service providers who created miniature commercial ecosystems around each installation. Religious and cultural tolerance within the Mongol Empire created unprecedented opportunities for intellectual exchange that enriched commercial relationships with deeper dimensions of learning and innovation. Islamic scholars found themselves discussing mathematical principles with Chinese astronomers. Christian monks exchanged theological concepts with Buddhist philosophers, and Persian poets collaborated with Mongol shamans to create hybrid literary forms. This intellectual cross-pollination occurred primarily through commercial networks, as traders served as informal ambassadors of culture, carrying not only goods but ideas, artistic techniques, and philosophical concepts across vast distances. The urban centers that flourished under Mongol patronage became laboratories of cultural synthesis, where traditional boundaries between civilizations dissolved into creative collaboration. In Karakorum, the Mongol capital, European craftsmen worked alongside Chinese artisans to create decorative objects that incorporated design elements from multiple traditions. Persian architects designed buildings that combined nomadic functionality with sedentary monumentality. Chinese physicians learned surgical techniques from Islamic medical texts while sharing their knowledge of pharmacology and diagnostic methods. The economic prosperity generated by secure trade routes created surplus wealth that was systematically invested in cultural and intellectual enterprises. Libraries expanded, astronomical observatories were constructed, and workshops were established where master craftsmen could experiment with new techniques and train apprentices in innovations that emerged from cross-cultural collaboration. This represented a fundamental shift from wealth accumulation for its own sake to wealth utilization for civilizational advancement. The transformation of traditional craft production under Mongol rule illustrates how political integration can stimulate technological innovation. Chinese silk weavers relocated to workshops in Central Asia developed new dyeing techniques by experimenting with Persian and Arab chemical processes. Islamic metal workers working in Chinese foundries created alloys and decorative techniques that combined the best features of both traditions. European glassmakers, established in Mongol cities, learned to incorporate Chinese ceramic glazing methods into their traditional techniques. The psychological impact of this unprecedented connectivity cannot be understated. For the first time in human history, individuals could conceive of the world as a single, interconnected system rather than a collection of isolated and mutually incomprehensible civilizations. Chinese scholars developed genuine curiosity about European intellectual traditions. Islamic philosophers seriously engaged with Buddhist metaphysics, and European merchants learned to appreciate the sophistication of Central Asian administrative methods. The luxury goods that flowed through these networks, silk, spices, precious metals, exotic textiles, represented more than simple commodities. They served as tangible connections between distant cultures, carrying embedded within them the aesthetic sensibilities, technical skills, and cultural values of their creators. A Chinese silk robe worn in Paris carried not only material beauty but allure, so the philosophical traditions that had shaped its creation. Persian carpets in Chinese palaces brought with them the mathematical principles and artistic conventions of Islamic civilization. As caravans moved like slow rivers across the continental landscape, they created currents of cultural exchange that would permanently alter the intellectual and artistic development of every civilization they touched. The Mongol achievement was not merely the creation of secure trade routes, but the establishment of conditions under which human creativity could flourish through encounter with difference, where innovation emerged from the productive collision of diverse traditions, and where the accumulation of wealth became a means for the advancement of knowledge and cultural sophistication. The cultural renaissance that flourished under Mongol patronage transcended mere tolerance to become a systematic cultivation of intellectual synthesis, transforming the empire's capitals into unprecedented laboratories of human creativity, where the boundaries between civilizations dissolved into collaborative innovation. This was not the simple accumulation of diverse cultural artifacts, but rather the emergence of entirely new forms of knowledge and artistic expression that could only have developed through the profound encounter between previously isolated intellectual traditions. In the halls of Karakorum, the Mongol capital, an extraordinary experiment in multicultural governance was taking place. Chinese scholars debated administrative philosophy with Persian bureaucrats, while European ambassadors observed Mongol shamanic ceremonies alongside Buddhist monks and Islamic theologians. This was no mere diplomatic courtesy, but a genuine intellectual engagement that reflected the Mongol understanding that effective governance required drawing wisdom from every available source of knowledge and experience. The astronomical observatory established in Marageh under Mongol patronage exemplifies the revolutionary potential of cross-cultural intellectual collaboration. Here, Chinese astronomers worked alongside Persian mathematicians, Islamic scholars, and European observers to develop computational techniques and theoretical models that advanced beyond what any single tradition could have achieved independently. The precise calculations developed at Marageh would eventually influence Copernican astronomy, demonstrating how ideas generated through cultural synthesis could reshape human understanding of the cosmos itself. Consider the profound transformation in artistic expression that emerged from this unprecedented cultural mixing. Traditional Chinese landscape painting began incorporating Central Asian motifs and techniques, creating hybrid visual languages that expressed new relationships between humanity and nature. Persian miniaturists developed innovative approaches to perspective and color by studying Chinese scroll paintings, while European illuminated manuscripts began reflecting Islamic geometric principles and Byzantine iconographic traditions. These were not superficial borrowings, but fundamental reconceptualizations of artistic possibility. The libraries that flourished under Mongol patronage became more than repositories of existing knowledge. They evolved into active centers of intellectual translation and synthesis. The House of Wisdom traditions of the Islamic world merged with Chinese scholarly academies and European monastic schools to create new institutional forms dedicated to the systematic comparison and integration of different intellectual traditions. Translators worked not merely to render texts from one language to another, but to create conceptual bridges between fundamentally different ways of understanding reality. The medical innovations that emerged from this cultural synthesis revolutionized healing practices across Eurasia. Chinese acupuncture techniques were integrated with Islamic surgical procedures, while European herbalism was enriched by Central Asian pharmacological knowledge. Persian physicians studied Indian Ayurvedic texts alongside Greek medical classics, creating therapeutic approaches that drew upon the accumulated wisdom of multiple civilizational traditions. Hospitals established in Mongol cities became international centers of medical education, where students could study under masters from different cultural backgrounds. The technological workshops established under Mongol patronage functioned as early research and development centers, where master craftsmen from different traditions elaborated to push the boundaries of their respective arts. Chinese papermakers worked with Islamic bookbinders to develop new techniques for manuscript production. Persian metallurgists collaborated with Chinese engineers to create more efficient siege equipment and agricultural tools. European clockmakers learned precision techniques from Chinese artisans while sharing their own innovations in mechanical engineering. The philosophical dialogues that took place in Mongol courts created unprecedented opportunities for comparative intellectual exploration. Confucian ethical systems were examined alongside Islamic jurisprudence. Buddhist metaphysics was compared with Christian theology, and shamanic cosmology was analyzed through the lens of Aristotelian natural philosophy. These were not merely academic exercises, but serious attempts to synthesize the best elements of different wisdom traditions into more comprehensive approaches to human knowledge and spiritual development. The educational institutions that emerged under Mongol rule reflected this commitment to intellectual synthesis. Schools were established where students could study multiple languages, compare different mathematical systems, and explore the relationships between diverse philosophical traditions. The curriculum in these institutions was revolutionary for its time, emphasizing critical comparison rather than rote memorization, encouraging students to identify both commonalities and differences between cultural approaches to fundamental questions. The patronage system that supported these intellectual endeavors reflected the Mongol understanding that cultural advancement required systematic investment in human creativity and scholarly exploration. Unlike traditional medieval patronage, which typically supported artists and scholars within established cultural frameworks, Mongol sponsorship specifically encouraged experimental work that crossed traditional boundaries and created new synthetic forms of expression and knowledge. The scientific innovations that emerged from this cultural synthesis had profound practical applications that improved daily life throughout the empire. Agricultural techniques developed through the combination of Chinese, Islamic, and European farming methods increased crop yields and enabled the support of larger urban populations. Engineering projects that incorporated knowledge from multiple traditions resulted in more efficient irrigation systems, more durable bridges, and more sophisticated architectural designs. The literary renaissance that flourished under Mongol rule created new forms of narrative and poetic expression that reflected the cosmopolitan character of the empire. Epic poems began incorporating heroic traditions from multiple cultures, creating hybrid literary forms that could speak to diverse audiences while maintaining artistic coherence. Historical chronicles developed new approaches to documenting multicultural societies, while philosophical treatises explored questions that could only have emerged from the encounter between different intellectual traditions. The musical innovations that developed in Mongol courts reflected the creative potential of cultural synthesis in the realm of aesthetic expression. Traditional Chinese court music was enriched by Central Asian instrumental techniques. Islamic musical theory influenced European compositional methods, and new hybrid forms emerged that incorporated rhythmic and melodic elements from multiple traditions. These musical syntheses created sonic landscapes that reflected the cosmopolitan character of the empire, while pushing the boundaries of what was considered aesthetically possible. The mathematical advances that emerged from this period of cultural interaction had profound implications for subsequent intellectual development. The integration of Chinese algebraic methods with Islamic geometric principles combined with European practical arithmetic created computational techniques that advanced beyond what any single tradition had achieved. These mathematical innovations would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution in Europe while simultaneously enriching mathematical traditions throughout Asia. The architectural achievements of the Mongol period reflected this commitment to cultural synthesis in their most monumental form. Buildings were designed that incorporated structural techniques from Chinese tradition, decorative elements from Islamic art, and functional features that reflected nomadic lifestyle preferences. These architectural syntheses created built environments that were simultaneously functional, beautiful, and symbolically representative of the multicultural character of the empire. As this cultural renaissance reached its zenith, it had created not merely a collection of diverse artistic and intellectual achievements, but a fundamentally new approach to human creativity that recognized difference as a source of strength rather than division, where the encounter between traditions became a catalyst for innovation rather than conflict, and where the highest achievements emerged from the collaborative engagement of humanity's diverse wisdom traditions. The gradual transformation of the Mongol Empire from unified nomadic confederation to collection of increasingly autonomous regional powers represents one of history's most instructive examples of how the very success of imperial expansion can generate the conditions for its own fragmentation. This was not a sudden collapse precipitated by military defeat or external invasion, but rather a slow, almost imperceptible evolution driven by the fundamental tension between nomadic political traditions and the administrative requirements of governing vast sedentary populations. The challenge facing Mongol administrators was unprecedented in its complexity. How does a people whose entire cultural identity is rooted in mobility and seasonal migration govern territories that require permanent bureaucratic structures, consistent legal frameworks, and stable institutional continuity? The initial Mongol solution, governing through existing local elites while maintaining ultimate nomadic authority, worked brilliantly in the short term, but created structural problems that would prove increasingly difficult to resolve as the empire expanded beyond the limits of effective central control. Picture the vast distances that separated the empire's extremities by the mid-13th century. A message dispatched from the Great Khan's court in Karakorum could take months to reach governors in Persia, while communications with European vassals might require half a year for a complete exchange of correspondence. Even the remarkable efficiency of the YAM system could not overcome the fundamental limitations imposed by medieval transportation technology when applied across such enormous distances. The succession crisis that followed Mongol Khan's death in 1259 revealed how difficult it had become to maintain the consensual decision-making traditions of nomadic society within an empire that now encompassed dozens of distinct civilizations. The Kurultai system that had worked effectively for selecting leaders of tribal confederations proved inadequate for resolving disputes over succession to an empire that controlled territories from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Regional governors, far from the traditional centers of Mongol authority, found themselves making increasingly independent decisions by necessity rather than design. Consider the psychological pressures faced by Mongol administrators who found themselves governing populations vastly more numerous than their own people. A Mongol governor in China might find himself responsible for territories containing millions of subjects while commanding military forces that numbered in the thousands. The mathematical reality of imperial overstretch created situations where local expertise became more valuable than traditional nomadic authority, where Chinese bureaucrats who understood agricultural taxation became more essential than Mongol military commanders who excelled at cavalry tactics. The religious and cultural policies that had been sources of strength during the expansion phase began to generate complications as the empire matured. While tolerance and inclusion had facilitated rapid conquest and integration, they also meant that subject populations maintained their distinct identities and loyalties rather than developing unified imperial consciousness. Chinese subjects remained fundamentally Chinese in their cultural orientation. Persian administrators continued to think in terms of Persian political traditions, and European vassals maintained their connections to European diplomatic networks. The economic integration that had been one of the empire's greatest achievements also contributed to its gradual fragmentation. As trade networks developed their own institutional momentum and local commercial eyes, interests became more sophisticated. Regional economies began to operate with increasing independence from central imperial authority. Merchants in the Western regions of the empire found it more practical to establish direct relationships with their counterparts than to channel all commerce through Mongol political structures. The military innovations that had made Mongol expansion possible began to lose their decisive advantages as subject populations learned and adapted to nomadic tactics. Chinese armies incorporated mounted archery techniques into their own forces. Islamic military commanders developed counter-strategies for dealing with Mongol cavalry, and European knights modified their equipment and tactics to better respond to nomadic warfare. The technological and tactical superiority that had enabled rapid conquest gradually eroded as military knowledge diffused throughout the empire. The generational changes within Mongol leadership reflected broader transformations in imperial character and priorities. Grandsons and great-grandsons of the original nomadic conquerors found themselves more comfortable in palaces than on horseback, more familiar with administrative documents than with the seasonal rhythms of pastoral life. This was not simply cultural corruption, but rather the inevitable adaptation of leadership styles to the practical requirements of governing complex sedentary societies. The legal and administrative challenges of governing multiple civilizations simultaneously created pressures that strained traditional Mongol approaches to conflict resolution and political decision-making. Issues that arose in Chinese territories required expertise in Confucian legal traditions, while disputes in Islamic regions needed to be resolved according to Sharia principles. The Mongol genius for practical adaptation that had served them so well during conquest began to work against political unity as administrators developed specialized expertise that was region-specific rather than empire-wide. The communication problems that emerged as the empire expanded beyond optimal size for nomadic administration created opportunities for regional autonomy that gradually became institutionalized independence. Governors who were forced to make decisions without consulting central authority because of communication delays eventually began making such decisions by choice, developing confidence in their own judgment and familiarity with local conditions that seemed superior to directives from distant capitals. The environmental challenges that had always shaped nomadic society, drought cycles, climate variations, disease outbreaks affecting livestock, continued to influence Mongol politics even as the empire expanded into territories where such factors were less relevant. When traditional pastoral regions experienced difficulties, the political attention and resources of Mongol leadership were naturally drawn back to their ancestral concerns, leaving subject territories to develop their own solutions to local problems. The cultural synthesis that had been one of the empire's greatest intellectual achievements also contributed to its political fragmentation, as regional variations of Mongol administration developed distinct characteristics that reflected local influences. Mongol governance in China began to incorporate Confucian elements. Mongol administration in Persia adopted Islamic features, and Mongol rule in Russia integrated Orthodox Christian and Slavic political traditions. These adaptations were individually successful, but collectively undermined the cultural unity that had originally held the empire together. The marriage alliances and diplomatic relationships that Mongol princes established in their respective regions created networks of kinship and obligation that sometimes conflicted with imperial unity. A Mongol ruler in Persia who had married into local noble families and whose children were being raised in Islamic cultural traditions naturally developed priorities and perspectives that differed from those of his cousins governing Chinese territories according to Confucian principles. As these centrifugal forces accumulated, the Mongol Empire gradually transformed from a unified political entity into a collection of related but increasingly independent regional powers. This was not failure but rather evolution, demonstrating the empire's fundamental success in creating conditions where diverse civilizations could prosper while adapting Mongol governmental innovations to their own cultural requirements and political needs. The devastating pandemic that swept across Eurasia in the 14th century traveling the same commercial arteries that had carried unprecedented prosperity under Mongol rule, represents one of history's most profound illustrations of how interconnection, while enabling remarkable human achievements, also creates vulnerabilities that can threaten the very foundations of civilizational progress. The Black Death was not merely a medical catastrophe, but a civilizational crisis that tested every institution, belief system, and social structure that medieval society had developed. The plague's initial appearance along the Silk Road trade routes that the Mongols had made safe and prosperous revealed the terrible irony that the empire's greatest achievement, the creation of secure channels for global commerce and communication, had become the mechanism for unprecedented destruction. The same merchant caravans that had carried silk and spices, mathematical treatises and artistic innovations, philosophical texts and technological marvels, now carried invisible death across continents with the efficiency that had previously transported the benefits of cultural exchange. Consider the psychological shock experienced by populations who had grown accustomed to the benefits of global connectivity, suddenly finding themselves isolated by fear of contamination. Cities that had thrived as cosmopolitan centers of international trade were transformed overnight into quarantined islands, their gates sealed against the outside world, their prosperity dependent on connections that had become channels of mortality. The same roads that had carried prosperity now carried terror, and communities that had welcomed foreign merchants began viewing strangers as potential harbingers of destruction. The medical knowledge that had been accumulated through centuries of cultural exchange proved helpless, inadequate against a pandemic that defied every therapeutic tradition that had developed across Eurasia. Chinese physicians trained in traditional balance theories, Islamic doctors versed in Galenic medicine, European practitioners following humoral principles, and Central Asian shamans working with spiritual healing techniques all found their accumulated wisdom powerless against a disease that seemed to mock the very foundations of medical understanding. The religious and philosophical frameworks that had provided meaning and comfort to diverse populations across the Mongol Empire were severely tested by a catastrophe that seemed to make no distinction between the righteous and the wicked, the learned and the ignorant, the powerful and the powerless. Buddhist concepts of karma, Islamic notions of divine justice, Christian beliefs in providential care, and shamanic understandings of spiritual balance all struggled to provide adequate explanations for seemingly random devastation that affected entire populations regardless of their moral or spiritual condition. The economic networks that had flourished under Mongol protection experienced systematic collapse as trade routes became pathways of contagion. Merchants who had built their livelihoods on long-distance commerce found their services no longer welcome, their goods suspect, their presence feared rather than celebrated. The standardized currencies, measurement systems, and commercial practices that had facilitated international trade became irrelevant when communities retreated into isolation and subsistence, abandoning the complex economic relationships that had characterized the height of Mongol prosperity. The urban centers that had been showcases of Mongol cultural synthesis were particularly vulnerable to pandemic devastation. The dense populations, international connections, and complex social interactions that had made cities like Samarkand, Baghdad, and Kiev centers of learning and commerce also made them ideal environments for disease transmission. The cosmopolitan character that had been these cities' greatest strength became their most dangerous weakness, as international visitors brought not only goods and ideas, but also pathogens against which local populations had no immunity. The administrative structures that had enabled the Mongol Empire to govern diverse populations across vast territories were strained to their breaking point by the pandemic crisis. Officials who had developed sophisticated systems for collecting taxes, maintaining roads, and facilitating commerce found themselves confronting problems for which their administrative expertise provided no solutions. The rational, efficient governmental approaches that had worked effectively for managing prosperity proved inadequate for addressing wholesale societal collapse. The intellectual and artistic communities that had flourished under Mongol patronage were decimated by pandemic mortality that showed no respect for learning, creativity, or cultural achievement. Libraries that had preserved manuscripts from multiple civilizations were abandoned as their keepers fled or died. Workshops where master craftsmen had trained apprentices in innovative techniques were shuttered as skilled artisans succumbed to disease. Schools where comparative philosophy and multicultural education had flourished were closed as teachers and students alike fell victim to indiscriminate mortality. The social hierarchies and political relationships that had provided stability across the empire were disrupted by pandemic mortality that created power vacuums and succession crises throughout the governmental structure. Traditional patterns of authority and obedience collapsed when entire administrative classes died within months, when military commanders found themselves leading forces reduced to fractions of their original strength, when the complex networks of kinship and alliance that had held regional governments together were severed by widespread death. Yet within this catastrophe, patterns of resilience and adaptation began to emerge that would eventually contribute to recovery and renewal. Communities that survived developed new approaches to public health and disease prevention, creating institutional innovations that would prove valuable for future pandemic preparedness. Medical practitioners who witnessed the inadequacy of traditional therapeutic approaches began developing more systematic methods of observation and documentation, laying foundations for more empirical approaches to understanding disease and healing. The religious and philosophical traditions that survived the pandemic crisis often emerged with renewed emphasis on practical compassion and social responsibility rather than abstract theological speculation. The shared experience of catastrophe created new forms of spiritual solidarity that transcended traditional doctrinal boundaries, as survivors recognized common humanity in their mutual vulnerability to forces beyond human control or understanding. The economic innovations that developed in response to pandemic disruption included new approaches to risk management, insurance, and commercial cooperation that would prove valuable for subsequent economic development. Communities that had lost traditional trading partners developed more diverse and resilient commercial relationships, creating economic structures that were less vulnerable to single points of failure. The political transformations that emerged from pandemic crisis included new forms of governance that emphasized local self-sufficiency and community resilience rather than dependence on distant imperial authority. Regional governments that had survived the crisis often developed more direct and responsive relationships with their populations, creating political innovations that would influence subsequent governmental development. The artistic and intellectual traditions that survived often emerged with renewed appreciation for human mortality and social interdependence, creating cultural expressions that reflected hard-won wisdom about the fragility of civilization and the importance of maintaining compassion and cooperation even in the face of overwhelming challenges. As the immediate crisis passed and survivors began the long process of rebuilding, the pandemic's impact had permanently altered the relationship between local and global, between the benefits of connectivity and the security of isolation, between the pursuit of individual prosperity and the necessity of collective resilience. The world that emerged from the Great Dying would be more cautious about the risks of interconnection, while still recognizing its benefits, more appreciative of local community, while remaining aware of global interdependence. The gradual transformation of unified Mongol Empire into distinct regional successor states represents not fragmentation but rather metamorphosis, as the essential innovations of nomadic governance adapted to diverse cultural environments and evolved into new forms that would influence political development across Eurasia for centuries. Each successor state, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and eventually the Mughal Empire in India, represented a unique synthesis of Mongol administrative genius with local cultural traditions, creating hybrid governmental forms that combined the best elements of both nomadic and sedentary political wisdom. The Yuan dynasty established by Kublai Khan in China exemplifies how Mongol rulers successfully integrated nomadic political flexibility with the sophisticated bureaucratic traditions of Chinese civilization. Rather than simply imposing nomadic customs upon Chinese subjects, the Yuan administration created innovative governmental structures that preserved essential elements of both traditions while developing new approaches to managing complex sedentary society. Chinese examination systems were maintained alongside Mongol military hierarchy. Confucian ethical principles coexisted with shamanic spiritual practices, and traditional Chinese artistic forms were enriched by Central Asian aesthetic influences. In Persia, the Ilkhanate developed perhaps the most sophisticated synthesis of Islamic and Mongol governmental traditions, creating administrative innovations that would influence governmental development throughout the Islamic world. Persian bureaucratic expertise was combined with Mongol organizational efficiency to create record-keeping systems, taxation methods, and judicial procedures that represented advances beyond what either tradition had achieved independently. The architectural achievements of the Ilkhanate, particularly in cities like Tabriz and Isfahan, reflected this cultural synthesis in built form, creating monuments that incorporated both Islamic geometric principles and Mongol spatial concepts. The Golden Horde's governance of Russian territories demonstrated Mongol capacity for indirect rule that preserved local cultural autonomy while maintaining ultimate political authority. Rather than displacing Russian princes and religious institutions, Mongol administrators developed tributary relationships that allowed local traditions to continue while ensuring consistent revenue collection and military cooperation. This approach created political structures that influenced Russian governmental development for centuries, establishing patterns of centralized authority and administrative efficiency that would characterize Russian imperial governance long after Mongol political control had ended. The intellectual achievements of these successor states reflected the continued vitality of cross-cultural synthesis that had characterized the unified empire. The astronomical observatories established under Ilkhanate patronage continued the tradition of international scholarly collaboration, bringing together Persian, Arab, Chinese, and European astronomers to develop computational techniques and theoretical models that advanced beyond previous achievements. The historical chronicles produced under Yuan rule created new approaches to documenting multicultural societies, developing narrative techniques that could accommodate multiple cultural perspectives within coherent historical accounts. The economic innovations that emerged from these successor states demonstrated how Mongol commercial principles could be adapted to different regional conditions while maintaining essential characteristics. The paper money systems developed under Yuan rule represented sophisticated experiments in monetary policy that anticipated many features of modern financial systems. The trade networks maintained by the Golden Horde created commercial relationships that connected Northern European markets with Central Asian suppliers, facilitating economic development across regions that had previously been commercially isolated. The military traditions maintained by successor states preserved essential elements of Mongol tactical innovation while adapting to regional strategic requirements. The composite bows, siege techniques, and cavalry formations that had made Mongol armies dominant continued to influence military development throughout Eurasia. However, these techniques were modified and integrated with local military traditions to create hybrid approaches that reflected both nomadic mobility and sedentary defensive requirements. The religious policies of successor states continued the Mongol tradition of tolerance and inclusion while adapting to local spiritual contexts. The Yuan dynasty maintained patron relationships with Buddhist institutions while respecting Confucian traditions and accommodating diverse folk religious practices. The Ilkhanate eventually converted to Islam but continued to support diverse religious communities and maintained the Mongol tradition of philosophical dialogue between different spiritual traditions. These religious policies created environments where continued cultural synthesis could flourish even as political unity dissolved. The artistic achievements of successor states reflected the ongoing creativity that emerged from cultural encounter and synthesis. Chinese painting under Yuan rule developed new techniques and subject matters that reflected Central Asian influences while maintaining essential characteristics of traditional Chinese aesthetic principles. Persian miniature painting during Tang's Ilkhanate period created innovative approaches to narrative illustration that combined Islamic artistic conventions with Mongol storytelling traditions. Russian artistic traditions were enriched by contact with Central Asian decorative techniques and aesthetic concepts. The legal innovations developed by successor states created hybrid judicial systems that combined Mongol customary law with local legal traditions. These synthetic approaches to jurisprudence often proved more flexible and effective than purely traditional systems, creating legal frameworks that could accommodate diverse populations while maintaining consistent standards of justice and governmental efficiency. The influence of these legal innovations extended far beyond the territories directly governed by Mongol successor states, as neighboring regions adopted successful techniques and adapted them to their own circumstances. The educational institutions established under successor state patronage continued the Mongol tradition of comparative learning and cultural exchange. Schools were maintained where students could study multiple languages, compare different philosophical systems, and explore relationships between diverse intellectual traditions. The curriculum in these institutions emphasized critical thinking and practical application rather than rote memorization, creating educational approaches that prepared students for functioning in multicultural environments. The architectural achievements of successor states created built environments that reflected cultural synthesis in permanent form. The palaces constructed for Yuan emperors combined Chinese architectural principles with Mongol spatial concepts to create hybrid structures that were both functionally appropriate and symbolically meaningful. The mosques and madrasas built under Ilkhanate patronage incorporated both Islamic and Central Asian decorative elements to create architectural styles that influenced building design throughout the Islamic world. The technological innovations that emerged from successor states demonstrated continued creativity in practical problem-solving and engineering design. The printing techniques developed under Yuan patronage advanced beyond previous Chinese achievements while incorporating innovations suggested by contact with other cultural traditions. The irrigation systems constructed under Ilkhanate rule combined Persian hydraulic engineering with Central Asian water management techniques to create agricultural infrastructure that increased productivity across previously marginal lands. The literary achievements of successor states created new forms of narrative and poetic expression that reflected the cosmopolitan character inherited from the unified empire. Epic literature produced during this period often incorporated heroic traditions from multiple cultures, creating hybrid literary forms that could appeal to diverse audiences while maintaining artistic coherence and emotional power. Historical chronicles developed innovative approaches to documenting multicultural societies, creating narrative techniques that acknowledged multiple perspectives while maintaining coherent chronological structure. As these successor states matured and developed their own distinctive characteristics, they demonstrated that the essential innovations of Mongol governance, administrative flexibility, cultural tolerance, merit-based promotion, and systematic approach to problem-solving could be successfully adapted to diverse cultural contexts while retaining their fundamental effectiveness. The political fragmentation of the Mongol Empire had not destroyed its institutional legacy, but rather dispersed it across Eurasia, where it continued to influence governmental development and cultural synthesis for centuries to come. In the corridors of contemporary power, where diplomats carry passports stamped with digital precision, few recognize the ancient lineage of their credentials. The leather-bound documents that facilitate modern international travel trace their conceptual origins to the Paisa, those golden tablets of authority that Mongol messengers carried across 13th century Eurasia. This continuity represents more than mere historical curiosity. It illuminates the profound institutional innovations that emerged from nomadic governance and continue to structure our interconnected world. The Mongol passport system, known as the Gereje, established principles of international mobility that transcend their medieval origins. When Marco Polo carried his Mongol credentials through the courts of Asia, he participated in humanity's first systematic attempt at global documentation, a recognition that legitimate authority could be portable, that trust could be encoded in symbolic objects, and that vast territories could be unified through standardized administrative tools. Contemporary international law, with its emphasis on diplomatic immunity and recognized documentation, represents an evolution of principles first articulated in the felt-lined councils of nomadic administrators. Consider the modern multinational corporation, with its distributed leadership, merit-based advancement, and cultural adaptability. These organizational structures mirror the decimal system that Genghis Khan imposed upon his military forces, not merely as tactical innovation, but as a revolutionary approach to human coordination. The Mingan, thousands, Jagan, hundreds, and Arban, tens, created scalable hierarchies that could incorporate diverse populations while maintaining operational coherence. Silicon Valley's emphasis on flat hierarchies in cross-functional teams represents a contemporary rediscovery of nomadic management principles, where competence rather than hereditary status determined advancement, and where organizational flexibility enabled rapid expansion across cultural boundaries. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, prefigured not only modern logistics networks, but the fundamental architecture of global communication. Those relay stations, spaced at precise intervals across the steppe, created the world's first integrated information network. Contemporary supply chain management, with its emphasis on just-in-time delivery and strategic positioning, employs methodologies refined in medieval caravan stops. The algorithms that optimize modern shipping routes trace their conceptual ancestry to the Mongol understanding that efficient movement required systematic infrastructure, that communication velocity determined administrative effectiveness, and that economic integration depended upon reliable transportation networks. In the gleaming towers of international banking, where electronic transfers move trillions across continents in milliseconds, the ghost of Mongol commercial innovation persists. The paper money that Kublai Khan's administration developed in Yuan, China, represented humanity's first systematic experiment with fiat currency, the revolutionary recognition that value could be symbolic rather than intrinsic, that trust could be institutionalized, and that economic efficiency required abstraction from physical commodities. Modern central banking, with its emphasis on monetary policy and currency stabilization, operates according to principles first articulated in the marble halls of Mongol administrative centers. The United Nations, despite its 20th century origins, embodies organizational concepts pioneered in Mongol Kurultais. Those great assemblies, where tribal representatives deliberated policy through consensus building rather than coercion, established precedents for international cooperation that transcend cultural boundaries. The principle of collective security, the emphasis on diplomatic negotiation, and the recognition that global challenges require coordinated responses, these foundations of contemporary international relations emerged from the pragmatic necessities of nomadic governance. When modern diplomats engage in multilateral negotiations, they participate in deliberative traditions refined in the windswept councils of medieval Mongolia. Religious tolerance, that cornerstone of liberal democratic theory, finds its most successful historical implementation in Mongol administrative practice. The principle of Yasa, the great law that protected diverse religious communities while demanding political loyalty, anticipated contemporary concepts of separation between church and state. Modern constitutional protections for religious freedom represent legal codification of pragmatic policies that Mongol administrators developed to govern multi-faith populations. The genius lay not in theological sophistication, but in administrative recognition that political unity could coexist with spiritual diversity, that effective governance required accommodation rather than conversion. Global supply chains, those intricate networks that deliver exotic commodities to local markets, operate according to principles perfected along Mongol trade routes. The standardization of weights and measures, the establishment of commercial courts, the protection of merchant communities, these innovations created the world's first truly international market economy. Contemporary globalization, despite its technological sophistication, relies upon institutional frameworks that nomadic administrators pioneered 8 centuries ago. The same principles that enabled Chinese silk to reach European markets through Mongol territory now facilitate the movement of goods manufactured in Asian factories to American consumers. Urban planning in the modern world bears subtle traces of Mongol influence, particularly in approaches to multicultural integration. Cities like Karakoram, where European craftsmen worked alongside Persian astronomers and Chinese engineers, established templates for cosmopolitan development that contemporary urban planners struggle to replicate. The principle of ethnic neighborhoods maintaining distinct identities while contributing to urban prosperity, the emphasis on commercial districts as zones of cultural exchange, and the recognition that diverse populations could generate economic innovation, these concepts emerged from the practical necessities of governing Mongol capitals. Environmental management, that pressing challenge of the contemporary era, might benefit from nomadic wisdom about sustainable resource utilization. Mongol pastoralism represented a sophisticated understanding of ecological balance, where human communities adapted their practices to natural cycles rather than imposing artificial patterns upon landscapes. Modern permaculture movements, with their emphasis on working with natural systems rather than against them, rediscover principles that nomadic peoples never abandoned. The recognition that long-term prosperity requires environmental stewardship, that mobility can reduce ecological pressure, and that human societies must operate within natural limits. These insights await integration into contemporary environmental policy. The digital age, with its emphasis on network connectivity and distributed authority, mirrors organizational structures that Mongols pioneered in the physical world. Social media platforms, where influence spreads through horizontal networks rather than hierarchical channels, operate according to principles that nomadic societies understood intuitively. The recognition that information wants to flow freely, that barriers to communication reduce efficiency, and that diverse perspectives enhance problem-solving. These technological insights reflect social wisdom that emerged from steppe societies centuries before the invention of computers. As we navigate the complexities of globalization, climate change, and cultural integration, the Mongol example offers both inspiration and caution. Their success in creating voluntary cooperation across vast distances suggests possibilities for contemporary international coordination. Their environmental adaptability provides models for sustainable development. Their religious tolerance offers precedents for multicultural harmony. Yet their ultimate fragmentation reminds us that even the most successful systems face natural limits, that growth cannot continue indefinitely, and that human organizations must eventually adapt to changing circumstances or face dissolution. Beneath the infinite expanse of Tengri's azure dome, where clouds drift like thoughts across the mind of eternity, lie wisdom teachings that transcend their nomadic origins to illuminate contemporary challenges. The Mongol understanding of leadership, forged in the crucible of steppe survival and refined through imperial governance, offers insights that resonate across centuries to inform modern organizational thinking and personal development. The principle of meritocratic advancement, so fundamental to Mongol society that it required no formal articulation, challenges contemporary assumptions about talent recognition and opportunity distribution. In a world where hereditary privilege often determines access to positions of influence, the nomadic insistence that ability should trump ancestry provides both inspiration and practical guidance. Genghis Khan's elevation of former enemies to positions of trust, his promotion of skilled administrators regardless of their ethnic origins, and his creation of institutions that rewarded performance rather than pedigree. These practices established precedents that modern organizations struggle to implement despite their obvious efficiency benefits. Consider how Subutai, a blacksmith's son, became history's most successful military strategist through systematic cultivation of tactical genius. His career trajectory illustrates principles that contemporary leadership development programs attempt to codify: the importance of mentorship relationships, the value of experiential learning, the necessity of taking calculated risks, and the recognition that exceptional performance can overcome initial disadvantages. The Mongol military's decimal organization created pathways for advancement that depended upon demonstrated competence rather than political connections, establishing meritocratic precedents that modern institutions often honor, more in rhetoric than in practice. Environmental wisdom embedded in nomadic culture offers profound insights for contemporary sustainability challenges. The Mongol understanding of seasonal cycles, their recognition that human communities must adapt to natural rhythms rather than imposing artificial patterns upon landscapes, and their sophisticated grasp of carrying capacity provide frameworks for addressing climate change and resource depletion. Nomadic pastoralism represented humanity's most successful experiment in sustainable resource utilization, where mobile populations minimized environmental impact while maintaining productive relationships with diverse ecosystems. The steppe taught harsh lessons about resource conservation that modern consumer societies have largely forgotten. Mongol families maintained minimal possessions, not from poverty, but from wisdom, the recognition that mobility requires simplicity, that accumulation can become encumbrance, and that security lies in adaptability rather than accumulation. Contemporary minimalism movements rediscover these principles, but often as lifestyle choices rather than survival necessities. The nomadic example suggests that voluntary simplicity might represent not sacrifice but liberation, not limitation but enhancement of genuine prosperity. Cultural integration strategies pioneered by Mongol administrators provide templates for contemporary multicultural challenges. The genius of their approach lay not in forced assimilation, but in practical accommodation, the recognition that diverse populations could maintain distinct identities while contributing to common enterprises. Modern nations struggle with questions that nomadic administrators resolved through pragmatic experimentation. How can traditional communities preserve their heritage while participating in larger economic systems? How can religious differences be acknowledged without compromising political unity? How can merit-based advancement coexist with cultural preservation? The Mongol emphasis on religious tolerance emerged from practical rather than philosophical considerations, but its implications extend far beyond administrative convenience. Their recognition that spiritual diversity could strengthen rather than weaken political institutions offers guidance for contemporary societies grappling with sectarian tensions. The principle that governance should protect rather than promote particular religious traditions, that political loyalty could coexist with theological disagreement, and that diverse belief systems often generate complementary insights. These concepts, refined through Mongol experimentation, anticipate modern constitutional principles while providing practical frameworks for their implementation. Diplomatic innovation represents another area where nomadic wisdom illuminates contemporary challenges. Mongol ambassadors operated according to principles that modern international relations theory has rediscovered: the importance of understanding local customs, the value of building personal relationships across cultural boundaries, the recognition that successful negotiation requires mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. Their diplomatic success stemmed from genuine curiosity about foreign cultures rather than mere tactical calculation, suggesting that authentic interest in others might prove more effective than sophisticated manipulation techniques. The Mongol approach to innovation, their systematic adoption of useful technologies regardless of their cultural origins, provides models for contemporary knowledge management. Their willingness to integrate Chinese engineering with Islamic mathematics and European craftsmanship created synergistic combinations that exceeded the sum of their individual components. Modern organizations often struggle with similar challenges. How can diverse expertise be integrated effectively? How can cultural boundaries be transcended without losing valuable local knowledge? How can innovation be encouraged while maintaining operational stability? Communication strategies developed across the Mongol Empire offer insights for contemporary global coordination. The Yam postal system represented more than efficient message delivery. It embodied principles of information sharing that modern organizations attempt to replicate through digital technologies. The recognition that communication velocity determined administrative effectiveness, that systematic information sharing enabled coordinated action across vast distances, and that reliable communication networks required substantial infrastructure investment. These insights remain relevant for contemporary leaders managing distributed organizations. Military innovations pioneered by Mongol commanders provide frameworks for contemporary strategic thinking that extend far beyond battlefield applications. Their emphasis on mobility over fortification, their integration of diverse tactical traditions, their sophisticated intelligence-gathering networks, and their psychological warfare techniques. These approaches offer guidance for organizations competing in rapidly changing environments. The principle of speed over size, adaptability over rigid planning, and intelligence over brute force. These strategic insights apply to business competition, political campaigning, and social change initiatives. The Mongol understanding of leadership succession, despite its ultimate failure to prevent imperial fragmentation, offers valuable lessons about organizational continuity. Their recognition that leadership requirements change as organizations mature, that different challenges require different skill sets, and that successful transitions require careful preparation rather than improvisation. These insights inform contemporary discussions about executive succession and institutional sustainability. The wind that whispers across contemporary Mongolia carries the same haunting melodies that once guided the horses of Genghis Khan, a rhythmic reminder that some forces transcend the temporary arrangements of human ambition. In the Orkhon Valley, where archaeological remnants of Karakorum emerge from grasslands that have known countless seasons of growth and dormancy, the eternal cycles that govern all earthly enterprises reveal themselves with crystalline clarity. Here, where stone foundations mark the former locations of palaces that once hosted ambassadors from every known civilization, the profound patterns of historical recurrence invite contemplation about the nature of achievement and the meaning of permanence. Modern Mongolian herders, descendants of the same bloodlines that once administered territories stretching from Korea to Hungary, continue their seasonal migrations along routes that have remained essentially unchanged for millennia. Their gers still dot the landscape like scattered stars. Their horses still navigate by landmarks that guided their ancestors. Their understanding of weather and season still surpasses the predictions of meteorological science. This continuity suggests that the deepest human wisdom often lies not in spectacular achievements, but in sustainable practices, not in monuments that proclaim greatness, but in ways of life that accommodate themselves to natural rhythms. The ruins of Mongol cities speak eloquently of impermanence, but they whisper even more profoundly of influence that outlasts physical structures. Karakorum's broken stones sheltered innovations that continue to shape contemporary institutions. The administrative buildings have crumbled, but the governmental techniques they housed persist in modern bureaucracies. The military headquarters have returned to earth, but the strategic principles they generated inform contemporary defense thinking. The libraries have scattered their scrolls to wind and weather, but the knowledge they preserved enriched civilizations across continents and centuries. This pattern, the dissolution of forms accompanied by the persistence of influences, reveals itself throughout historical analysis. The Roman Empire's political structures collapsed, but Roman law continues to inform contemporary legal systems. The Greek city-states vanished, but Greek philosophical methods remain fundamental to Western intellectual tradition. The British Empire dissolved, but English language and parliamentary procedures spread across the globe. Similarly, the Mongol Empire's political unity fragmented, but its innovations in communication, administration, and cultural integration became permanent contributions to human civilization. The contemporary visitor to Mongolia encounters this paradox of permanence within change at every turn. Ulaanbaatar's modern skyline rises from steppes that have known the passage of countless armies, the establishment and abandonment of numerous capitals, the rise and fall of multiple empires. Yet beneath the urban development, the essential landscape persists. The same rolling grasslands, the same seasonal rhythms, the same vast sky that inspired nomadic peoples to understand their place within cosmic patterns, rather than attempting to impose human will upon natural forces. Sacred mountains that once received offerings from Mongol shamans continue to command reverence from contemporary Mongolians, suggesting that spiritual insights often prove more durable than political arrangements. The eternal blue sky that legitimized Khan's authority remains a source of meaning for people whose daily lives bear little resemblance to their nomadic ancestors. This continuity indicates that the deepest human needs, for connection with natural forces, for understanding of cosmic purpose, for participation in something greater than individual existence, transcend specific cultural expressions while finding renewed articulation in each generation. Archaeological excavations in Mongolia reveal layers of human habitation stretching back thousands of years, each stratum representing a different approach to the challenge of thriving in demanding environments. The Mongol period represents one particularly successful adaptation, but the geological record suggests that human ingenuity has repeatedly found solutions to survival challenges, often building upon innovations developed by previous inhabitants. This archaeological perspective provides reassurance that human creativity has deep roots, that contemporary challenges have ancient precedents, and that solutions often emerge from unexpected combinations of traditional wisdom and innovative thinking. The seasonal migration routes that continue to crisscross Mongolia provide metaphors for understanding historical change itself. Like nomadic families following ancient pathways between winter and summer pastures, human civilizations move through predictable cycles of expansion and consolidation, innovation and conservation, growth and decline. These patterns need not inspire fatalism, but can instead provide perspective on contemporary challenges, suggesting that current difficulties represent temporary phases within larger cycles, rather than permanent conditions requiring desperate solutions. Modern Mongolia's position between Russia and China mirrors the geopolitical complexities that shaped medieval Mongol diplomacy, suggesting that some strategic challenges persist across centuries. Yet contemporary Mongolian leaders navigate these pressures using diplomatic techniques refined by their ancestors, demonstrating how ancient wisdom can inform modern statecraft. The recognition that survival often depends upon maintaining independence while acknowledging larger forces, that small nations can exercise influence through careful positioning rather than direct confrontation, in that cultural identity can be preserved even while adapting to changing circumstances. These insights prove as relevant today as they were during the empire's height. The eternal return to this landscape, whether through physical pilgrimage or imaginative journey, offers profound consolation for contemporary anxieties about change and uncertainty. The steppes teach patience with natural rhythms, acceptance of seasonal variations, and confidence that adaptability enables survival even through dramatic transitions. These lessons, written in wind and grass and endless sky, provide wisdom that transcends specific historical periods to address the fundamental human condition. Above the infinite expanse of Mongolian grasslands, where the dome of heaven meets earth in an unbroken circle that encompasses all terrestrial concerns, the same constellations that guided Genghis Khan's armies toward distant horizons now watch over a world transformed by journeys they initiated 8 centuries ago. These ancient stars, burning with light that began its journey across cosmic distances, while nomadic empires rose and fell, provide perspective that dissolves the urgency of contemporary anxieties into the gentle rhythms of celestial time. The Great Bear, known to Mongol astronomers as the Seven Gods, still wheels through northern skies above cities that exist because of trade routes their empire established. The Pole Star, that fixed point around which nomadic navigators oriented their travels, continues its eternal vigil over landscapes where modern descendants of steppe peoples maintain traditions that stretch back through generations beyond counting. In this continuity lies profound comfort, the recognition that human stories, however dramatic, unfold within patterns larger and more enduring than individual ambitions or fears. The wind that carries these words across centuries whispers the same lullabies that once soothed the children of nomadic families, the same gentle melodies that accompanied the dreams of warriors and merchants, scholars and craftsmen, all those whose lives contributed to the great tapestry of human experience. Their stories have joined the eternal conversation that connects all generations, the ongoing narrative in which each person participates briefly before passing their portion to others who will carry it forward into unimaginable futures. Sleep comes naturally under such vast skies, where the scale of cosmic time reduces daily worries to their proper proportions. The empire that once stretched across half the known world has returned to grass and wind and starlight, but its essential gifts, the connections it forged, the innovations it fostered, the wisdom it generated, continue to enrich human experience in ways both visible and hidden. Like seeds scattered by nomadic winds, these influences have taken root in distant gardens, flowering into forms their original gardeners never imagined, but would surely recognize as offspring of their planting. Rest now comes easily to those who have traveled in imagination across the steppes and through the centuries, who have witnessed the rise and transformation of the world's greatest land empire, who have learned from ancestors whose dreams were as vast as the sky that still shelters their sleeping descendants. The stories that began with whispers from the steppe conclude in peaceful dreams, where ancient wisdom continues its patient work of shaping tomorrow through the mysterious alchemy of memory and sleep. In dreams, the eternal return continues, and all stories find their way home to the infinite sky,